The Jacksonville Jaguars have made a trade before the start of the NFL draft here in less than a week, and we're going to be talking about it, breaking it down, what it means for the Jaguars, not only for the draft, but also in future moves they could make, and just the overall construction of this roster ahead of the 2026 NFL season. This is Jags Now, presented by Prize Picks, our wonderful sponsor here. I am your host, Cullen Brown, and we're going to get into this trade and what it means for Jacksonville here, now, and into the future. Before we get into it, guys, if you could hit that subscribe button, because when news like this happens, we make a video about it. I put a short out on the channel, all my social medias. We've got you covered here. Jags news or major reports or anything like that happens, we've got you covered here on the channel. So you're never going to want to miss out whenever news breaks. Hit that subscribe button for the best Jaguars coverage here on YouTube. All right, so just to go over the official trade details, the NFL has sent out a trade per Adam Schefter that the Jacksonville Jaguars have traded defensive tackle Maason Smith to the Atlanta Falcons for defensive tackle Ruke Orhorhoro, a defensive tackle out of the University of Clemson. Both have been 2-year veterans in the National Football League. I'm going to break things down from kind of Maason Smith's kind of aspect of this and why I think he was ultimately moved by the Jacksonville Jaguars, and then I'll get into Ruke Orhorhoro's side and then maybe some more just kind of general thoughts on where the Jaguars could potentially go from here. But Maason Smith was a former, obviously, pick from the Trent Baalke era, former second-round pick out of the University of LSU, and just never quite found his footing. Did have 3 sacks his rookie year, and you thought, okay, maybe if he could build upon that, maybe that he could look at a guy or could be a guy in the Jaguars defensive line rotation. And he, did have that kind of lower leg injury, the kind of soft tissue injury that he was dealing before training camp last season, and just never quite, got his feet going in terms of last year. Was kind of pretty much out of the defensive tackle rotation. And it's a shame because he was looked at as a potential piece long-term. The Jaguars at the time, obviously, were going to use as part of their future when you've got guys like Arik Armstead, and DaVon Hamilton, who's getting older, Matt Dickerson's now 30 years old, and I just think he never quite panned out into what the Jaguars wanted him to be. He obviously wasn't from this current regime where James Gladstone, Liam Cohen, Anthony Campanelli, all these guys. So they decided to move on from him. And instead, they bring in a guy in Ruke Orhorhoro. So former Clemson Tiger, spent 2 years obviously in the NFL, had 3.5 sacks last season, 4 tackles for loss, 6 quarterback hits. Didn't necessarily grade out the best per Pro Football Focus, but a guy that I think if you're Jacksonville, right, you're looking to kind of pivot off a guy who is not in your plans for the long term. Could a guy like Ruke Orhorhoro, who, see what he's listed in here, apologize, looking it down, 6'4", 295, could he be a potential guy that is a rotational defensive tackle that, he didn't grade out the best in last year for the Atlanta Falcons in terms of run defense, but as a pass rusher, he was solid, 53.5. So could he be a guy that slots in behind an Arik Armstead there on the defensive line and kind of is a good rotational piece? I'm intrigued by this move. Long story short, I think that Ruke Orhorhoro is somebody that I remember when he originally got drafted, I was like, oh, that's a nice move for Atlanta, because I thought going into that draft, he could be somebody that disrupts pockets in terms of being a developmental pass rusher in the league. And I don't think he's quite hit his potential yet as a defensive lineman, but clearly James Gladstone, Liam Cohen, they've kept tabs on him, and they're interested in potentially bringing him in and see what he could do in Jacksonville. So I'm very much interested to seeing what he can do. But in the meantime, I will say it's kind of TBD, but I'm excited about this move. One-word reaction. I'm going to ask you guys here before we get into our lovely sponsor, Prize Picks here. What's your one-word reaction to this trade? Like I said, mine is optimistic, if I were to say. I think Ruke Orhorhoro can provide some things, which we'll talk more on the back half of the show about. But I do think optimistic would be the word I would use. So without any further ado, guys, we'll talk about this more here in just a second. But today's show would not be possible without our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks, today's show is sponsored by Prize Picks, America's #1 sports picks app. Playoffs are here for basketball. Baseball is underway. You've got hockey that's going on, and it's time to cash in with Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 sports picks app and is the best place to win cash while watching sports. If you're a hoops guy, you can go with points, rebounds, assists, blocks, three-pointers. If you're more of a seam head, you can go hits, home runs, strikeouts. The app is really easy to use. Just pick more or less on a few players' stats and lock in your lineup, and you could win big. I've got a 2-pick lineup for football season here, right next to me, that I'm rocking with for the entire football lineup season. More on Trevor Lawrence's 3,699 passing yards, more on Tedero McMillan's receiving touchdowns. This is a really good lineup that I'm rocking with. $20 to win 60 here at Jags Now. But if you guys want to follow or fade my picks, this is what I'm rocking with. Be sure to do so with Prize Picks. New user offer. Download the Prize Picks app today with a link in the comments and the description and use code HMA to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code HMA to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, it's good to be right. All right, getting back into more of the show here. So, Ruke Orhorhoro, the newest member of the Jacksonville Jaguars. We had talked about it ad nauseum, and I even mentioned it in the show that we did earlier today, which, hey, we a little ahead of the curve here. We had been saying, and I think a lot of Jaguars fans would agree with this, the Jaguars need to get younger at defensive tackle. Well, you bring in a guy in Ruke Orhorhoro who is currently 24 years old, just recently turned 24 years old, by the way. Again, it's not like you're getting younger in the aspect of, like, obviously Maason Smith was also younger, but you bring in a guy that you're saying, hey, you're still on your rookie contract. What can you potentially bring to this defensive line group? And we're going to kind of see where it goes from here. And I think that if you're Jacksonville, I think a lot of questions that fans are going to have is, will this affect the Jaguars' draft strategy? I'm not going to say it will majorly. Now, could it affect it in the fact that, all right, if you had a guy, and I'm just going to use the examples that we used from the video earlier. Let's say one of the 3 defensive tackles that I think could be likely or would be the most likely out of the top 5-ish defensive tackles in this year's draft class that I think could fall to the Jaguars, whether that be Christian Miller, whether that be Lee Hunter, whether that be Christian Miller, Lee Hunter, Caleb Banks out of Florida. If one of those guys falls to you at 56, I would say that the Jaguars, and if they like, obviously, one of them, whether they have them higher or lower on their board, depending on how James Gladstone and the entire front office and the team views them, I think it wouldn't deter them from making that selection based on just trading for Ruke Orhorhoro, in my opinion. Now, if you're sitting there and you get to, round 3, maybe round 4, and you still haven't taken a defensive tackle yet in terms of where things are falling on your board. Like, obviously, I think they're still going to go into this draft with defensive tackle on their mind. But if you don't get one that you love at the value, which I full disclosure, I don't think it's likely that at any of their day 2 picks, whether it's pick 56, whether it's 81, whether it's 88, whether it's 100, I think if a defensive tackle that they like is on the board at one of those 4 picks, they will select a defensive tackle in this year's draft and have him be a major factor alongside Ruke Orhorhoro, alongside potentially a DaVon Hamilton and an Arik Armstead and this, that, or the other. And that's your group. But if for whatever reason they just don't love the value and, maybe they don't take one at 56, maybe they go linebacker if, Anthony Hill, Jake Golday, one of those guys falls to you. And then they get to round 3 and they're like, actually we like some other positions. Maybe we like a tight end, maybe we like a safety or whatever the case may be. And just defensive tackle just never kind of falls that way. I don't know how much confidence I have in Ruke Orhorhoro being a starting caliber defensive tackle, but that's not what you're necessarily asking him to be here. You're asking him to be a rotational guy along with Matt Dickerson to kind of be that front line for Jacksonville. And ultimately they're going to have to make a big decision on Arik Armstead, who's set to have a $19 million cap hit this upcoming season. So will they potentially look to restructure that contract? Will they look to potentially cut him post June 1st so that they can make some room to sign some of their draft picks? I'm not sure. Ruke Orhorhoro, to me, is a guy that can compete with Matt Dickerson for that DT3 spot. I wouldn't feel comfortable with him as your DT2 kind of starting level defensive tackle in this league, at least not yet. And that shouldn't stop the Jaguars from pursuing a defensive tackle that they like in rounds 2 or 3. But I do feel more confident in their defensive tackle depth chart with this move. And I'm interested to see where it kind of goes from here. This was a trade that was kind of just didn't really have any smoke to it, just kind of came out of nowhere. The Adam Schefter notification just kind of dropped in on all of us. So James Gladstone's always cooking, right? He's not afraid to make moves, as we've now clearly seen throughout his tenure here as the Jaguars general manager. I would expect that to continue, and potentially even in the NFL draft. Like, there's a guy, whether it's a draft prospect or a player that could be available, do not be surprised if James Gladstone gets aggressive and goes after what he thinks could make this roster into more of a Super Bowl contender. All right, that is going to be it for today's show, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Jags Now, presented by our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know down below and give me your thoughts on this Ruke Orhorhoro trade for Maason Smith down below in the comments section, guys. And until the next one, we will see you. Peace out, and have a great rest of your weekend.